In this podcast, I'd like to talk about conditional constructions. I'm assuming that you're going to read Fundamentals of New Testament Greek, chapter 29, very carefully. I'm not going to go over every single detail with regard to conditional constructions. In fact, there are five classes of these constructions that are presented in the grammar. I'm only going to go over the two most common of those, so make sure you read that chapter very carefully. That said, let's begin by talking about a few general characteristics of conditional constructions. Well, first of all, what is a conditional construction, or a conditional clause, a conditional set of clauses? Actually, it's a clause complex. It's the if-then sort of structure that you find pretty typical across all kinds of languages. We see these in English quite often and use them quite often in English. The Greeks, no exception to that rule. They used conditional constructions quite a bit. And actually, what fascinates me about these things is seeing how these things are used to position readers. And so we're going to talk in this podcast in just a couple of seconds about two of the most common ones. One is the first-class condition. And I'll mention to you that there, you can use those kinds of conditioned constructions, easy for me to say, to actually assert a point, to get readers to think kind of logically about what it is that you're saying. And that point may or may not be true. It may or may not be reality, but it is an assertion for the sake of argument. So more to come on that. Another kind is to present a hypothesis, a hypothetical situation. And, if that hypothetical situation were to ever become reality, then you'd make a point based on whatever that is. That's the then part of that. There are two parts to these, obviously, an if part and a then part. And in Greek grammar, when we talk about these, we talk about a protasis and an apodosis. The protasis is the if part of these constructions or these structures, and the apodosis is the then part of these constructions. When you see these in Greek, you'll see that the conjunctions a or aon are used. And those are the two particles that are used for these conditional structures. You see a, which means if, and aon, which also means if. The main difference is a is generally used with the indicative, and aon is generally followed with the subjunctive, which, if you remember that little on particle, alpha nu, look at aon. It is actually a crassus. Remember way back in chapter 1 in Fundamentals of New Testament Greek, we talked about different things that words can do. And sometimes they crash into one another. That's called crassus. So here you have a, if, crashing into on, the conditional particles it's sometimes called, and you come up with aon. And so if you remember though, on, that particle is generally followed by a verb in the subjunctive. That's going to be helpful to know when you're looking at conditional constructions, as you'll see in just a moment. So again, a or aon means if. The then part of these, the apodosis, the word then that you would gloss into English, isn't really a Greek word that's there. It's generally implied in the context because it's set up by a or aon. There are, as I mentioned, 5 classes of these constructions, and you can go to your Greek grammar, chapter 29, and see a discussion of those 5. And actually, I think there's even more than 5, but these are the 5 main ones that are found in the New Testament. And frankly, a couple of these are common, and the rest of them, there's 2 that are common and 3 that are found in the New Testament. And actually, one of those other 3 is really debated if it really is a complete conditional construction or not. So you can kind of look at the grammar and take a look at that. I'm going to look, and we're going to look together only at first-class conditions and third-class conditions in this podcast. So let's take a look at an example of a first-class condition. As I mentioned, a first-class condition is one of those that begins with a. All right, this is a, and it is semantically, its point is to state a condition for the sake of argument. In other words, it's used to assert something for the sake of argument. Now, a lot of older grammars and commentators will generally say in their commentaries or grammars that in this class of condition, you might as well just gloss it as since and not as if, right? I'll show you an example of one of these in just a moment. But Porter is actually correct. Porter, Reed, and O'Donnell in Fundamentals of New Testament Greek, chapter 29. It's actually correct to say that's an overinterpretation to say that every time you come across one of these, you should gloss it as since. They give an example, actually, where since would not make any sense. So Jesus at one point says, and this is the example from the grammar, if I cast out demons in the name of Beelzebul, then, and he goes on to make a point. And the point doesn't make any sense. The then part, the apodosis, doesn't make any sense if you were to gloss it as since, because Jesus doesn't cast out demons in the name of Beelzebul. And so since wouldn't make any sense. My preference is that you should just gloss these as if, and understand that what you're seeing and what you should interpret from these is that there is an assertion being made for the sake of argument. I've already mentioned this begins with a, and in the pronosis with a, there will be a verb that is in the indicative mood. When these are negated, you'll see oo used and not may, because oo is the typical negator for indicative verbs. There's sometimes where may will sneak in and negate an indicative verb, but not very often. Most of the time, oo is what you'll find negating indicatives. So a plus the indicative in the protasis. The apodosis can take just about any mood of verb or any tense form of verb. Let's look at an example. Here's an example of exactly what I was talking about a minute ago. This is from Colossians chapter 2, verse 20. And it reads, E apathanates sun Christo apaton stoikeon tu kosmu, tihos zontes en cosmo dogmatitseste. Now, roughly or woodenly gloss, it's if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, and then he switches over to a question, why, as though you are living in the world, do you submit to its dogmas, its rules? Now, if you were to gloss this as since, you could say that makes some sense. Since you died with Christ, then why do you do this? Well, that's true, and that would be fine in this particular instance. However, what Paul is doing here is he's actually getting the readers to think about, and he's saying, if, for the sake of argument, he's saying, just for the sake of my argument, if indeed you did die with Christ, then why are you acting like you didn't? And this is a way for him to position the readers so that they have to go, oh, well, maybe if I'm continuing to live by the rules and dogmas and the ways in which the way in which the world gets things done, and maybe that means I didn't really die with Christ, that makes this argument that much more powerful, significant, and important for the reader, because it positions them to make them think, hey, I've got to rethink this for just a minute. The screenshot that I've given you here on the screen is from a website that I kind of edit with a group of other people. It's called opentext.org, O-R-G, opentext.org. And what it does is it breaks the entire New Testament down into clauses. And we'll talk more about this in an upcoming podcast when we look at a brief syntax of clauses in FNTG 30's podcast. And here it is. You've got two clauses here. And what I want to show you here is how these relate to how the protasis and the apodosis relate to one another most of the time in the New Testament. So here you have a plus the indicative. The first clause is it is a dependent clause. In open text speak, this is called a secondary clause. It's got a little bit of a gray background to it. It's indented over a little bit. You'll notice that it has in green the numbering col.c2_56. That means it's Colossians chapter 2, clause 46. Then you see just underneath that a little blue arrow that points down, and then it says C2_57, and that's the number that you have on the next clause, which is pink in its background, and it's back over to the left. It's not indented. That's a primary clause or an independent clause, if you want to use more traditional syntactical terminology. So what this is showing you is that the if part, the protasis part, the if part is dependent upon the then part, right? So actually what is asserted here is in the primary clause. Why, as though you are living in the world, do you submit to its rules? Now, you could rewrite that question as a statement. You are living in this, you are submitting to the rules as though you were living in the world, right? And so this is a way to kind of rethink the assertion that is being made for the sake of argument here, right? He's causing them to kind of go back and question and think about their relationship to Christ and their relationship to the world. And it all centers in his theology around dying to the world and living and being raised with Christ. Another example of this in Colossians is chapter 3 and verse 1. if you've been raised with Christ, then seek things that are above, and so on. So that's a first-class condition. A plus the indicative in the protasis, just about any verb in the apodosis, and it is a condition that makes an assertion for the sake of argument. And I say translate those as if and not as since. How about a third-class condition? The second most common condition in the New Testament is the third-class condition, and these are the more hypothetical sorts of conditions. These present, as the grammar says, a tentative hypothetical argument. This is often the way we use the if-then statement, these conditions in English, is we want to hold up some possible thing for consideration, and if it happens to be the case, then some consequent will ensue. So here you have, though, a grammatical difference. You have the aeon plus the subjunctive in the protasis, and that is really the signal that you're working here with one of these hypothetical situations, a third-class condition. And again, the apodosis in these may take just about any verb in them. They can be indicative, they can be subjunctive, they can be actually present tense, they can be in perfect tense forms, whatever. So aeon plus the subjunctive is the main key in the protasis. So let's look at an example of this. 1 John 1:6. There are a number of these in 1 John. This is chapter 1, verse 6. Ean epomen hati koinonion echomen metautu kai entoskate peripatomen pseudamatha kai upoiumen ten aletheon. So if we happen to say, or if we would say, that we have fellowship with him, and yet we happen to continue to walk in darkness, or we happen to be walking in darkness, pseudamatha, we lie, kai u poiumen, and we do not do tain aletheon, the truth. And so here you have the aeon plus the subjunctive. There's actually apomen is in the subjunctive, and then you have peripatomen in the subjunctive, and what's being held up here is the hypothetical situation is saying that we have fellowship with him, and yet walking in darkness, right? So if that situation should happen to be the case, not saying that it is, not saying that it isn't, just asking or raising it, saying, if this happened to be the case, then the consequence is we lie, and we do not do the truth. So I really like these third-class conditions. I like them all, actually. They're fun for me because my area of research often is about how language users use text to position readers and get them to think in different ways in argumentation and things like that, how they try to persuade. And these are very important tactical, from linguistic perspective, very important tactical means for getting that done. So raising up some sort of condition and then talking about some sort of consequent that is based on that. The first-class condition ones are those that are assumed to be the case. They are asserting something for the sake of argument. And then a consequent is discussed. In the third-class condition, you have a hypothetical situation that's raised, not saying that it's the case, not saying it's not the case. It may or might be, or may or might not be. But if it is, or if it happened to be, then the consequent would ensue, which would be, in this instance, we lie and do not do the truth. So those are the two main conditions in the New Testament that we find. You can read up more about those in your grammar, and then I also want you to read about the other conditional constructions as well, and because I may be asking you about those in some homework or in the review or on the test. All right, looking forward to seeing you online in class.